Ladies and gentlemen, get the book Dr. Joshua Bowen wrote, The Atheist Handbook to the Old Testament. It is extremely full of knowledge and information for anyone, as well as join the Patreon. There's hundreds of videos that have been not released to the internet. You can ask questions and I will record them with these scholars in high definition. I do that all the time. You can also personal message me and you help the community grow. Thanks a lot. Dr. Joshua Bowen, author of many books. I've got some Patreon member questions, and this will be the first recording we do. Whether I launch it first or not, doesn't matter. Artie Hagen asks, for Dr. Joshua Bowen, much of the Bible seems tenuous from a contemporary historical perspective. Which is the earliest story, event, or person in the Bible that would you consider to reflect potentially reliable history? What would be the likely date of that narrative, and when was the narrative likely written?
Yeah, the question of sort of the historical veracity of stories in the Hebrew Bible, sort of like the perennial question, right? It always comes up. And the rule of thumb, I guess, that I think most scholars would say is that the further back in time that the narrative takes you, the less reliable it is. So, you know, on one extreme, you go back to Genesis 1 and 2 and the creation accounts, you know, least reliable maybe, like that whole primeval history era, least reliable. And then, you know, coming down into like the post-exilic period, you know, that's much more reliable, right? So, and there's sort of a time, I think, that most scholars would probably say that once you get into like, definitely by the 8th century, maybe by the 9th, you know, what the Bible is describing, what the Hebrew Bible is describing is, obviously take out the supernatural stuff, but, you know, it's pretty close. And I would say even, you know, the Davidic stories, while I don't think that they represent an accurate historical depiction in the sense that it's something without spin, I think Joel Baden would argue pretty convincingly, he's got a book out on this talking about David, that the stories themselves represent a type of historical reality that again, has been subjected to this sort of political spin. And so, you know, you end up with a text that takes something that has David acting as essentially like a mob boss and spins it in such a way that the bad guy becomes the good guy and the good guy becomes the bad guy. And I think that for me, just the general rule of thumb, if you're talking about the patriarchs, talking about the primeval history, talking about the Exodus is probably the place that it starts to make a turn. And what I mean by that is, like, everybody relax, like all of you out there relax. The Exodus, I think, probably represents, the story itself contains probably a kernel of truth, right? It's probably remembering some sort of historical reality or based on some sort of historical reality. So, I mean, like, we know that Semitic peoples were slaves in Egypt. We know that Semitic people escaped from Egypt. And we know that Egypt was, of course, in control of Canaan for much of the second half of the second millennium. So I think those historical truths, those historical realities, more than likely informed this memory that the Exodus seeks to, or that the Exodus was built upon or built up around. So yeah, that's what I would say. Patriarchs, primeval history, you know, I don't think they hold a lot of water. I don't know that there was a Moses figure. It doesn't really matter to me if there was. You know, if there was, great. Like, I don't really care. The legend that's built up, it's sort of, I think of Moses slightly differently, but pretty close to how I think about Gilgamesh, in the sense that, like, I actually think we have pretty decent evidence for Gilgamesh, but it doesn't matter. Like, it wouldn't matter to me if tomorrow archaeologists said, hey, we actually have really good evidence that there was a person named Moses, like in the 13th century or something. Because that doesn't then mean, in the same way that it doesn't mean that because there was a Gilgamesh that all the things that are said about him are now suddenly true, all the supernatural things that he did. In the same way, if Moses suddenly turned up as a real person, or even Abraham or Isaac or Jacob, that the stories that built up around them reflect historical reality. So I guess that's how I would answer that question.
So to put it simply, for those who are probably watching going, would you say that maybe the Moses tradition is the oldest? Or this isn't easy to answer. I mean, it's putting itself in approximately, and I'm giving the Hyksos guys a little credit here, 1500 to 1200, but really 1200s BCE. It's saying as if it's during this time. But as far as like, when do you think we don't have any doubts? Like, when do you get to a guy and go, without a doubt, the earliest you can think of, where you go, okay, we have no reason to think Ezra didn't exist.
Oh, sure.
Or Hezekiah, or, when do you say the earliest we are pretty definite based on other sources as well to say this guy existed?
I mean, I do think, if you're asking like consensus scholarship, I don't know that I've thought about it enough to give that answer. I think most everybody would probably say the divided monarchy is pretty solid footing of the House of Omri. I mean, we have like the Jehu, the stele that's got Jehu on his knees. So I do think that, and I'm sorry that I'm not more articulate. These questions, I'm kind of getting them as you say them.
Right.
So I haven't had time to really prep anything. But, and that's what I like to do, is look back over my notes. But I think that David, those things reflect historical reality, probably contemporary historical accounts. But again, they're heavily spun. So you can't just, you can't go reading Hittite apologia, right? You can't read, what these Hittite kings say about, the events that brought them to power, and say, oh, well, that must be exactly how this happened. That's not the case. It's not how historiography works. But yeah, I mean, I would say the divided monarchy, probably most mainline scholars would say we're on pretty sure footing. Lester Graby has a really good book on this, a really good recent book on this. But also like William Deaver's book, Did Archaeology Bury the Bible? I think he goes through sort of the archaeological evidence that we have for things like the House of David or Jeroboam, Rehoboam, those sorts of things. So
I think the David thing, just on that note, is like you talked about being spun. And then people will go, well, if he did exist, right, it's evidence because you see embarrassment, right? And so there's some interesting points to be made here that Joel Baden discusses when he says, look, you can say, well, it wasn't embarrassing then, but why is Chronicles spinning it then? So there seems to may have been a guy, but not necessarily a kingdom, but maybe there was a guy in a small little something in the south, or even in the north. But the north was bigger than the south, so.
Yeah, I mean, this is sort of the thing that always puzzles me, and it puzzles me about the whole Jesus. Was he a historical figure? Was he, myth? That whole debate, it's odd to me because I get to the end and I say, so what? And again, putting it back in the terms of Gilgamesh, like I can't imagine somebody vehemently fighting for Gilgamesh being an actual figure, like an actual person in the third millennium, a king over Uruk, and like fighting tooth and nail either to make him a historical figure or to say he was a myth. Because like at the end of the day, so what? Because everybody would say, whether he's a real guy or not, he didn't race the sun through a tunnel. He didn't go, cross the deadly sea to reach Utnapishtim. He didn't fight the bull of heaven. you know, he wasn't proposed to by the goddess Ishtar. He wasn't 2/3 divine, right? This is the point. So whether that individual is a historical figure, which again I think he is, or not, is sort of it's one of those things that's, if you're coming at somebody like Jesus, you're coming at somebody like Moses as an apologist, and you're trying to make the argument this is a historical person. What I often see is the reason that they do that is, see, he's a historical person, therefore
He walked on water.
and it's like, wait a minute. Like, you don't go to Spider-Man and say, look, there is a New York City, therefore he was able to shoot webs from his hands and fly from building to building. Right? Well, no, there is no therefore. If you're trying to argue from that, it's a disconfirming thing. It's something that you wouldn't even want to bring up, I wouldn't think, because your opposition is going to be the one that is saying, all right, look, your holy book, whatever, says that this place was in existence and that place was in existence. This is why in the conquest account, we talk about things like Jericho or Ai or any of these other Canaanite cities, because they're disconfirming of the story, right, as it stands in its canonical form. So if Jericho's not there, that's bad. If it is there, it's not that it's good for the narrative of the Bible. It's like, and just because Hatzor is there and it looks like it has a destruction layer that could fit with, you know, the period of the conquest, that's not confirming. It's just not disconfirming. Mm-hmm. So
it's, you know, I heard the same thing, and we'll wrap this up with the historicism. A lot of historicists who are arguing on the Jesus stuff, which still can be used in arguments like you're talking about with these patriarchs and whatnot, and they'll say, really, historicism has a better chance at being true, period, no matter how you wrap it up. Because if there is some, and this doesn't prove historicism, this is just the point, like James, the brother of the Lord, okay? You have to either make that mean a brother in Christ in some sense or something like that. Mm. But if it means an actual biological brother, he existed. Yeah. Doesn't, like you said, it doesn't add all the other stuff. It doesn't make the myth true.
Sure.
But there's so many ways in which, even if one of these things is accurate, it does give it verisimilitude to history. But yeah, there's so much stuff to consider about this, and I really enjoy it. I like looking at it, and I think what we do too often is we're approaching an ancient text with this analytical either-or mindset, not realizing myth sometimes is written historically.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, and I mean, if the argument were there's no ancient Israel, well, the moment you have the Merneptah still, it says 1207 here, Israel's seed is no more. Oh, there's an Israel, right? So in that sense, it works. But nobody's arguing. I mean,
there
aren't many people that are arguing that there's no Israel, right? It's that the text as it stands and the supernatural, the canonical form, and the stories that are in it probably don't reflect reality as they were. Right, they've been at a minimum greatly embellished, and that there's probably some historical reality behind it. So then going to Pithom and Ramses, and trying to show that here the path out of the wilderness could work, and I mean, great. It's not it's just not disconfirming. Whereas if you say Jericho didn't exist in this size as a city, or Ai was destroyed in the 3rd millennium and there was nothing there during the period of conquest, whatever you wanted in the late 2nd millennium, that is disconfirming. That story as it stands didn't happen that way. So,
Thank you.